Hi, Professor Humphrey. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you so much.
Yeah, my mouse stopped working. I had to change the batteries. Sorry for being a few minutes late. I'll try not to make that a habit.
Not a problem at all. It happens.
Come on, Sydney, it could be worse.
Oh my God. Sorry.
All right. Let's see. So we still have folks coming in, but we are ready to rock and roll.
In that case, let's get this party started.
Let's get it started quickly. Let's see. We are 04 files.
Hey, Professor Humphrey.
Hi.
I don't know if you can see it on the screen that it's Reagan. I'm on my phone today because I accidentally signed up for a class that's actually in school, like on campus.
Uh-huh.
And it starts at 2:20. So I was gonna go to Nova today and ask if if there was any place opening for next week, so I can just sit and take the class at be at your class virtually at Nova, and then walk to my other class.
Okay.
So I just wanted to give you a heads up. So if I accidentally leave early, I don't mean to. It's just because I'm driving to the school.
I had the same issue, and there's a spot at the end of the library where they're letting people hang out and do homework. So I'm just here doing my Zoom call in the library at Nova. So you could probably do the same thing.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Thank you.
No problem.
Well, as long as you guys have made me priority, I guess I can agree with everything else. All right, so let's see. I think we have, let me see how many people we have. We're actually doing pretty good. And Alexander, Alexander Asmar, I did get your email, so I'll be sending you something later.
Okay, and that YouTube link, and the YouTube link did not work for me.
Did it work for others?
Yes.
Yeah, I was able to watch it.
Yeah, it worked for me.
Oh, so Alex, it's you, not me.
All right, I'll check again then.
I'll resend it to you, buddy, if you want.
Okay.
Yeah, if it didn't work, it may have been something. I'll send it to you again.
It might be the browser.
Yeah, are you using Google Chrome or are you using
Safari?
Oh, Safari. So it might be, try Chrome.
Okay.
All right. So wait a minute. If you got Safari, then you're on the Mac.
Yeah.
Okay, you're on a Mac. I haven't tried it with them. Does anyone else have a Mac and tried to watch the video?
I do.
It's just YouTube video, yeah.
Okay, then I'll just send it to you again, Alex.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. We'll get it going. All right, good. Okay. So let's see, we've got 39 people, so I'll assume that we're ready to rock and roll. Okay, so we're going to start with chapter 1 today. So before we do that, any questions over anything that we talked about last, what's today? Today's Wednesday, so Monday.
I do have one question.
Yes.
When is the proposal due for the essay?
For the assignments, whenever you'd like to send them.
So I could send you, for the essay that we have due, I could just send it to you, today if I'm ready?
Yeah, if you'd like.
Okay.
And what I would recommend, Ron, is if you, I'm sorry, is it Rowan or Rohan?
Rohan.
Okay, I want to be correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
So you can send first, second, third choice kind of things.
Okay.
Because what I'm doing is accepting first come, first serve. So since there are only 3 people who can do the same story, if you send your first, second, and third, if you are the first one that I received, then of course you get your first choice. But if others have already taken it, then at least I would have something I could respond to you and give you an affirmative. But yeah, you can start doing that today if you'd like.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. Anybody have one of those 5, what are the 5 hour, what are the drinks? The energy drink?
The 5-hour energy.
Energy.
Yeah, so, somebody walk over and get one to Sydney. She's having a rough day. She's having a rough day. I gotta get her moving. I gotta get her. I gotta get her
This
moving.
is so wild for you to be coming at me like this so early in this semester. I'll say.
That's okay. We've got a lot of semester left, so we'll be okay.
Sure do, sir. We sure do.
Okay, so let's go back and start with chapter 1 and get into this. So we were talking on last Monday, about this idea of, deepening your understanding and it affecting your relationships, interactions, even career choices. Because the more you understand what kind of triggers there are that cause you to be emotionally stable or unstable, cause you to be angry or happy, the more you understand the dynamics of those and how you can be influenced by others, then of course, it helps you to navigate through your own life. So what I'd like to do is, as our first question, is there anything in this billboard that you find attractive? And let's
You
add
mean
to
besides
that.
the exceedingly attractive lady on the picture, right?
Oh no, that can be part of it.
I like the words Christmas and sparkle.
Okay. Why? Why do you like Christmas and sparkle?
Christmas always has a warm feeling for me.
Okay.
And sparkle, I think a lot of girls in my family love, the whole sparkle thing. I don't care if it's glitter or sparkle's fun. The word's even fun.
Okay, cool. Now the person who said an attractive woman, what do you find attractive about her?
The eyes, nail polish,
Okay.
the motion of the body and how it's, excelling at showing off these rings and Christmas and the billboard.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what you looked at, not the thought that she could possibly be naked. Yeah.
There's that possibly too.
Yeah, I got that. Right, but that's the beauty of it, because everything that you guys just said fits with this idea, the study of behavior and mental processes, right? So marketers, advertisers, their entire life is spent on trying to construct an image that will reach you at some level, that will promote your purchasing or buying something from them.
Is this why schools make us cover our shoulders?
I'm sorry?
Is this why schools make us cover our shoulders?
It depends, right? Because based on the premise that you have, you may say, oh man, this is Christmas. Why did she have her shoulders covered? So I'm leaning toward protecting her and putting some cover on her. But other people will look at that and they will say, yeah, maybe this is a beautiful woman. If you notice that all of her features have been darkened, and the lipstick, the eyeshadow, all of the stuff, the hair, even the jewels that she has on are dark, but they sit against this really Christmassy background, this friendly, lively, light blue, even the snow at the bottom, even though it's not snow, but it depicts all of that. So it adds to this Christmas idea. And then, of course, the sparkle. So if I'm someone who's attracted to this woman or thinks that this woman is beautiful or something like that, my thoughts are, oh, here's a beautiful woman that seems more approachable if I add some sparkle to her Christmas. So, yep, I'm going to Kay's. They went to Jared's, because I'm going to get something that's going to make my girlfriend, if I'm looking at this just simply as a woman, I'm going to make something that's going to make my girlfriend get undressed, right? So notice the picture doesn't identify that she's actually undressed. but it's simply the image that we create. And then as long as that image touches you in a way, it may prompt you to believe that, yeah, sparkle, jewels, diamonds, those kind of things equal romance and a sultry woman. And it doesn't have to mean any of that. I mean, if you look at the cars, the BMWs, the Mercedes, the what is it? They're really expensive ones. The Rolls Royces, all of those cars. You look at those cars, and most will never use all of the features associated with it. But those are the things that will attract you to the car. And I'm not against any kind of car that you have, but if you're just trying to get from A to B, you can get a $15,000 car. But if you want to get to A to B and look really good in it and have other people ooh and ah over what you're driving, then you go toward the 60, 70, 80, 90, $100,000 car. They do the same thing, but it's the feeling that's associated with it. So the study of behavior and mental processes, how do we condition people and influence people to do the things that we want them to do? And we create that image that will most likely cause an emotional response. And if you get that emotional response, then yep, you're more likely to associate the things that created that emotion. And then you become a subscriber to Christmas or to jewelry or to something like that, because the associative value gives you joy. And that's all that's happening. So when we look at these things, every advertisement that you see or commercial, or even the movies and television and all of those things are to create an image to draw you in. And when they draw you in, now you become a representative for them. Because if you watch a particular show, you'll now talk to your friends and say, oh man, I watched something last night. It was amazing. It's on Netflix. I mean, you got to watch this. You got to see that. Here's what that. So now you become this advertising to create emotional content for someone else. And now it starts to become the domino effect. And that's the idea. So this critical thinking piece goes right back. And who remembers the web of psychology? We talked about it briefly Monday. Who remembers? Who's going to get the extra point today? Yeah, don't all jump in at once.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What was I mentioned something that was the web of psychology on Monday. Ooh, nobody.
Defining how online environments kind of influence our thinking.
See, I absolutely love that gallant try, even though it wasn't correct. I still like that you took the initiative to step out on faith. Excellently done. So remember I talked about experiences. Experiences become information. Information go into memory. Memory becomes knowledge. Knowledge becomes decisions. Decisions inform our behavior.
Oh, with like, wasn't it with the video when they were talking about how like the first 7 years of your life is when like you get all of your knowledge download and you basically base all of your like things that can happen to you off of those first 7 years?
Yeah, after we
and how those first 7 years continue to influence us throughout the rest of our life, right, without us even probably being consciously aware.
Yes, it is applied to that. After we watched the video, that's when I wrote on the whiteboard that circle, that web of psychology, because it's not just the first 5 or 7 years, it's actually through life. So all of our experiences, no matter when they happen to us, are going to generate some kind of thought that will lead into a decision that will inform or influence our behavior. So critical thinking, though, applied to that, if you notice, it's the process of objectively evaluating, comparing, analyzing, and synthesizing information. Right? So how do you objectively evaluate something? What must exist? What must exist in order for you to effectively or objectively evaluate something?
Knowledge.
Knowledge is a part, but that's a byproduct of it.
Subconscious?
Conscious, I mean, is a natural state.
There has to be something to evaluate or talk about.
Yes, right. So yeah, that's it, right? So I can't evaluate something if I don't know what it is. So that, the reference to knowledge was correct, except I have to first have knowledge of it. So in order to evaluate something, I must have knowledge of it. And then to compare it, it means, again, simply that in order to evaluate one thing, if I need to know what something is, then I also need to know what it isn't. Right? Because you don't know darkness without light. You don't know beauty without the absence of beauty. Right?
We need to make connections.
Not necessarily connections. We're looking at the state. Right? So let's say that I'm comparing, oh, I've got a cup here. So we're comparing cups, right? And I say that I want a cup that maintains, yes, it maintains heat better, it doesn't get cold as quickly, it's easy to hold. Well, whatever those criteria are, I need to know the opposite of those so that once I do an evaluation, I know what I'm looking for, and I also know what I'm not looking for. Right? So in comparing the two, first I have to have knowledge of what I want, and then compare it to something that either satisfies it more or less. And then once I have that, the analysis comes in. So I analyze based on that information, that knowledge that I have, does this fit the criteria? If it fits the criteria, well, I take all of the criteria because maybe the handle, maybe the cup is made of material that really works well, but I've got pretty large hands. So maybe the handle needs to be larger than what it is. Maybe the bottom, because I'm going to sit it on a coaster or I'm going to ride in the car, it needs to fit in the cup holder, right? So I synthesize all of the information that I want. Will it hold it? Can I hold it well enough? Will it sit in a particular area? What kind of liquid works for it? Once I have all of that information on what it is and what it isn't, I synthesize that information to look for the greatest outcome. Well, think about it. You do the exact same thing. With almost everything that you do, you make a decision, consciously or subconsciously, toward it being painful or not. And usually, if something is painful, you choose to avoid it. If it causes pleasure, you're attracted to it. So now I'm not going to qualify what pain or pleasure is, because some of us like things that one person may see as painful, another person sees as pleasure. So I'm not going to qualify that for you. But we make decisions based on the absence of pain and what some may see as pain, again, pleasure. For instance, some people like horror movies. And some people have, if they watch a horror movie, they have nightmares. So for them, the presence or the possibility of nightmares disallows them to go and watch that movie. But someone else may find a lot of joy and pleasure in getting that surprise, that shock, being, intimidated, whatever it is, right? So I can't qualify it for each person, but that decision is based on whether or not something is going to cause me greater pain than pleasure or greater pleasure than pain. All right. So a last example, if you've ever gone to the dentist to have your wisdom. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you mean physical pain or mental pain or both?
It can be both. It can be both, but it's still a qualifier. So we still compare it. So for instance, Alex, if I say, again, if you've got a wisdom tooth that you want to get pulled out, right? That's physical pain. But if the pain of having that wisdom tooth is causing you to have a toothache every night, you can't sleep, whatever that is, that when you go to the dentist, they're going to have to cut into your gum, reach in with some kind of whatever they use, and take that tooth out. But you make a decision and you say, well, you know what, that's short-term pain versus this long-term pain. So I'm willing to accept a little pain to get a greater benefit. Right? So that's the physical side. The mental side, let's say that one of you who's on the screen, decides that you've seen somebody on their screen and you're attracted to them. And you say, you know what? After the class is over, I'm going to send them a little chat. And I'm going to say, you know what? You want to meet after the class? Now, someone who thinks that that will cause a beneficial outcome will type in the chat. But someone who's a little less confident may say, man, I'm not going to put that in the chat, because if I put that in the chat, everybody else in the class is going to see that. And if she or he says no, then I'm going to be embarrassed. Right? So two people looking at the exact same event will qualify it based on whether they believe they're going to get benefit from it or whether it's going to cause pain. So it can be mental or physical. Did that answer it, Alex?
Yes, it did.
Okay, good.
Thank
All right.
you.
You're welcome. So in
What
every
about
case, yeah,
sorry
I'm
to
sorry.
interrupt. What about people who like I don't know, for lack of a better term, enjoy pain? People who are like masochists or like into stuff like that. Like, how does that work with this kind of response?
Because you qualified it as pain, for them, they qualified as pleasure.
Okay.
Right? So you
Interesting. All right.
associate pain because for you, maybe, and I don't know this, you might be a masochist, but right now, using the statement, because you said, you know, for people who are masochistic or sadomasochistic, whatever they are, and they like pain, or you didn't say they like pain, but introduce pain, right? That's because from your viewpoint, why would you do that to yourself? Why would you use whips and chains and all this other stuff, right? But for somebody else, being in bondage, having someone else control their behavior, and even their sexual relationships, for them, they find great joy in that. They don't see it as pain, they actually see it as a joy. Right? So that's why I say I can't qualify it for one person or the other. It depends on your perspective as it relates to that particular event or that particular behavior.
Okay, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So as we look at this, now, of course, I will offer that the difference between what is considered a valid psychology and a pseudo-psychology that's shown here is in experimentation. Right? So there is something called statistical significance. And that simply means that if I set up conditions, I want to know within a certain, well, with a level of certainty, that those conditions will almost always produce the same outcome. So if someone is allergic to, I don't know, grass or vegetation, right? If I set up an experiment and each time I use a particular plant, I see that person has an adverse reaction, then I can say with certainty that whenever that condition exists, it causes the same outcome or a similar outcome. So statistical significance, and we'll look at this later, says that if 90% of the time or more, I get the same result based on those conditions, then it is scientifically valid. But if it's less than 90%, it's not scientifically valid because it says it's the luck of the draw. So pseudo-psychologies are those that we can't prove within a reasonable expectation or level of certainty that you will get the same results if you do it over and over and over and over. So psychic readings, one person may go in and get a reading and say, you know what, you're going to come into money in a week. But if they go back and they do another psychic reading, they could get something completely different. There is no way to validate that as an exact science. So subsequently, that's why it's called a pseudo-psychology. It may sometimes work, but we can't prove that it works 90% or more of the time. So palmistry, astrology, they used to have a science called phrenology, and the people who were the experts would literally read the bumps on your head. And the bumps on your head were supposed to equal a particular disorder, right, or condition. Again, if you can't prove it within 90% of the time within that experiment, it's considered a pseudo-psychology, and that's all that is, okay? All right, so let's go back and build into psychology. So prior to the structuralist movement, psychology was considered a non-science because number one, and I would say it's valid back then, because they didn't have the tools, equipment, nor do they have enough research to validate that certain behaviors and certain thoughts and feelings could cause a particular response or reaction. But as Watkins, I believe it was Watkins, who first started studying that, well, if we don't have the ability to read someone's mind. However, we can try to evaluate that person's views, his or her perspectives. So if they tell me what they're experiencing, maybe I can associate it with something as a probable cause and help them get through it. So structuralism, notice, sought to identify the structure of mental life by identifying elements of conscious experience. Well, introspection is your inward view of yourself. So it's a self view. So introspection was used for people to disclose how they saw their problems manifesting themselves, so that the therapists or psychiatrists or whomever could try to evaluate certain events that were causing those particular experiences. Now, again, because we can't read people's minds, we had to rely on the person's disclosure and how well they could reconstruct their experiences so that we could evaluate them. But structuralism started to go by the wayside because they said, well, wait a minute. You have to trust that the person is telling you the truth. You have to trust that the person isn't making it up. And if they are, then how do you evaluate it? Well, since there was no way of validating that, functionalism started to raise its head and say, well, let's look at the behavior. And if we look at the behavior, then we simply look at how it manifests itself as opposed to what caused it. So structuralism was about the cause, functionalism was about the cause and the result. So it identified functions of experience and how it helps us adapt to our surroundings. So now, what are the triggers for experience in one person's life versus another? Why does someone feel like they gain a benefit from being angry? Why does someone benefit from being empathetic or sympathetic? So the idea was, functionalism says if we look at the behaviors and what the results of those behaviors are, then we would have a better sense of what's causing it as opposed to relying on someone to tell us. Okay, is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. If it ever gets muddy, let me know, because I've got 1,000 examples laying back in my head. All right. So this became the foundation for psychoanalytic, or the field of psychoanalysis. So most of you are familiar with Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud is the father of the psychoanalytic model. And we'll talk about him in much more detail later on. But again, the idea was, because we can't read someone's mind, and of course back in the 1930s when Sigmund Freud first fathered all of this thought, there were no MRIs or any other kind of electronic tools that they could use to see which areas of the brain were activated based on differing emotions and thoughts and behaviors. So Freud effectively said, well, since we can only see the outcomes, he presupposed that it's because of unresolved conflicts. And since it's unresolved conflicts, then that person is holding that in, and because they're not allowing it to surface, it's causing the disorders that the person experiences. So someone who, the biggest thing, or one of the largest things that's happening right now is sex trafficking, where they're abducting young girls and boys for sex trafficking. Well, think of the person who's doing that. Very seldom is that person going to go on ABC or CNN and said, hey, look, you know what? I'm looking for little boys and girls so that I can put them into sex trafficking, right? But internally, there is something that prompts someone to take the livelihood of someone else away for gain or benefit or whatever it's going to be. So Freud effectively said it's because of those unresolved conflicts that people behave the way they do, either to try to satisfy that unresolved conflict and or to create an image that won't associate them with that unresolved conflict. Who was the dude that killed all the women and thought he was an attorney? He wanted to be a lawyer.
Ted Bundy.
Ted Bundy, right? So Ted Bundy created an image that he was very intelligent, that he loved women, loved his interaction with women, right? And he was on the side of good. But what they found was his relationship with his mother and other women were so negative that the way that he tried to resolve that was creating an alter ego. But he created the alter ego because subconsciously the issue of not having a strong feminine relationship caused those issues to surface. And then they manifested themselves in a way that once he got close to someone, well, I will overpower them and show them that I really am worth having some attention. So that's the kind of story, and we'll look at that later when we talk more about Freud. But that's how it started. So from structuralism to functionalism, and then it led to the first real psychology, which was considered psychoanalysis.
Is there a possibility that it's not like that people do bad things not necessarily because it's an unresolved conflict, but just because their motive is like money or something?
Yeah,
but
yeah, very seldom is it something else. If it is something else other than an unresolved conflict, it is usually as a result of a natural disorder, so a developmental issue in the brain.
Okay.
But even the need for money may be unresolved conflict, because before they didn't feel like the only way they could own up and be considered successful and be seen as others as successful was to achieve money because they didn't have it before.
Okay.
Yeah. So generally it's not just unresolved conflicts, right? So it's unresolved conflicts. It can be desires, those desires that are unresolved or unsatisfied. And subsequently, those could also cause abnormal behavior, what we will call abnormal behavior. Yeah.
Dr. Humphrey, what happens
Yes, sir.
if there's no resolution to the unresolved conflict?
That's the problem, Alex. Because for people who have those unresolved conflicts, at some point, not with everyone, but at some point, if it bubbles to the surface, then it generally results in the behavior that tries to create equilibrium, right? Most people, like I said, everything in psychology really is about satisfying our needs, but we have to define what those needs are. So if my needs are unresolved, really just like the rest of the body, we're trying to create an equilibrium, a balance. So if someone feels like, let's use the Columbine High School shooting, for instance. The kids who did that shooting said that for years, they felt less than. They felt like they were bullied. They felt like everybody was laughing at them. Nobody was paying attention to them. And so in order for them to create an equilibrium, even though it was absolutely horrific, in order for them to create an equilibrium, they went to take back their control. And the only way they felt like they could really do that was by making the other people who made them suffer also suffer.
Yeah, but isn't it also true that, for instance, like bullying, if you're bullied so much that it actually causes you to kind of snap and you end up doing something that you just never intended to do?
Yeah, but Mr. McDonald, isn't that the same? Right? Because if you have been bullied, most people who are bullies, and I can't speak for all of them, but the majority of them who are bullies have lost their control. And someone else has taken authority over them. That's why they were bullied. And so in order to balance out their lives, they take that same experience and then bully others, because that's the way they get their control back.
Okay.
Yeah. So no, your example is absolutely right, but everything is trying to create balance. And sometimes, as the question Alex asked, was if we don't resolve those conflicts, what might happen? Well, it's those kind of things, because if there's no other way for them to create balance except to do something extreme. And that's the problem. Now, not everyone acts out on their unresolved conflicts. So some people manage it, they hold it for their lives or whatever they're going to do. But for some people, it manifests itself in a way that does become dire. And that's an unfortunate outcome of it.
And those
Okay.
those are the people that tend to have like underlying mental illness, right? Like I feel like a school shooter has to have like some kind of deep-rooted mental illness to do something so extreme, because people are bullied all the time and they don't act in such a crazy way that would impact so many people's lives.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be a mental disorder.
Really?
No, it doesn't. Because disorders tend to be characterized by something that is either genetic or biological. But we can create mental conditions that are unstable, not as a result of biology, but simply because of sociology, right? Going back to what Mr. McDonald mentioned, right? So if I have someone who's a really good person naturally, but then every time they go somewhere, people are beating them up, taking their money, spitting on them, laughing at them, doing whatever they're doing. Sociologically, now that person feels like they are alone, they're isolated. And the only way that they can strike back is to take their control. So it's not necessarily a genetic disorder or biological disorder. This is created as a result of sociology.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it doesn't discount that there aren't mental disorders that cause people to do things, but generally that's an extreme condition. Because if we look at the majority of people who have created heinous acts, the majority of them were conscious of those acts, and they did it because they had a problem with society and the environment and culture.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So, and again, guys, when I offer my opinion, that's all it is. I will try to satisfy it with theory, but please don't take that your answer or your statement isn't correct. We'll just try to qualify it so you can see both sides. Okay. All right. So what we're going to take a look at, there are 7 major perspectives, but we aren't going to look at all of them. We will look at 6 and 5 of them in depth. The psychodynamic, notice it doesn't have psychoanalysis up there, but the only reason I think that it doesn't is because psychoanalysis deals with the unconscious dynamic. So the same thing that I have for psychodynamic, psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic deals with unconscious dynamics, unconscious motives, conflicts, and past experiences. But they do that from the individual perspective. So they say that each person, for psychoanalytic, each person has their own unresolved conflicts and dynamics simply because of who they are. Psychodynamic says the same thing, however, psychodynamic says that it involves a change based on our environments. So psychodynamic adds in an external environment that helps to create the conditions, the unconscious dynamics. But it also says that those unconscious and unresolved conflicts can be changed based on the environment. So they both deal with the unconscious. Behavioral is about the interaction with others. So how do I behave based on emotional, cognitive, physical, biological inputs? And based on that sensory input, how do I now respond? So we look at how people can be conditioned to have certain triggers that cause them to automatically respond in a certain way. Humanistic, yes, I'm sorry, Stephen, did you have a question, or that's just an arm stretch? Okay, all right, so humanistic represents self. So the study of humanism is how do we help the person gain a level of self-confidence and self-awareness? So this is almost completely introspective. Cognitive, and we will look at memory and other things. How do we think? What causes us to think certain ways? And even how do we process thoughts in the brain? Biological, we'll look at briefly because we'll talk about the science of neurons and transfer of information through the brain and how that's constructed, but that will only be a short piece. Evolutionary, we won't talk about a lot, although we will talk about some of the theories and principles associated with it. And then sociocultural is just an expansion of behavioral. Because the behavioral is about how do I interact with someone else. Sociocultural says how do the actions of other people influence me, right? So we'll look at all of those, but some in more depth than the others. And here they are again. So just an example of graphic of what we just talked about. So any questions on either of these 7, folks?
No.
Okay, all right. You can look at this on your own. I don't tend to spend time on it. If any of you are psychology majors and you're looking for a specific area to discuss, I'm open to having a conversation with you about one of the fields that you might want to pursue. I'm familiar with, actually I'm familiar with all of them. So if you have any questions about any of these, I'll be happy to have a conversation with you about them. Okay, so now let's get into the nitty-gritty, or a little bit more into it. So as I said before, we can observe, we can create experiments, and we can even participate in experiments, but at some point we have to define the validity of the theory. And so in order to do that, we're either going to do basic research or applied research. And I'll give you an example for both. So basic research, research conducted to advance scientific knowledge. First question, and you can type it in the chat room so that I will know that you are here. But in the 1920s, and even before the 1920s, maybe even as soon as the 1930s, doctors prescribed a certain drug to pregnant women to help them be calm during their pregnancy. What do you think that was? So even if, and even if you don't know, then type in "don't know." That's okay.
I'm not sure.
Xanax was not in the 1920s. But that's okay. Okay, some of you got it. It was cigarettes. So doctors literally prescribed cigarettes for pregnant women because they believed that the nicotine would allow them to be calm. So basic research, right? Research conducted to advance scientific knowledge. If they had done no more studies on the effects or impacts of nicotine, they may have never found out that it was causing significant problems in the fetal stage of development. So basic research looks at what already exists, looks at the conditions as they currently are, and says, does the scientific knowledge, does the research still apply? And the reason that it's typically done in a university or research laboratory is because they want to establish the conditions that were used before and then modify those as necessary to see the change in what the research was and how it becomes more current. Only if you were pregnant? No, I don't know what the other things they did, but remember, cigarettes at one point were the pièce de résistance. If you wanted to be cool, if you wanted to be an adult, if you wanted to be, you know, whatever, a part of the group, then you smoked. Everybody in the movies smoked because that was the way that you were cool, and they didn't understand the negative impacts of it. But of course, that same thought was around pregnancies. That's the only example that I have right now. Psychoactive substances are controlled. Well, and we'll talk about that more, but just as a quick answer, the psychoactive substances, whether they are depressants or whether they are amphetamines, have different responses in the brain when we talk about neural transfer. And so if, dependent on what the condition is, they try to limit it because it does create a chemical imbalance in the body. And some of it can be negative, highly negative, or sometimes they use it as a control factor. We'll talk about that much much more in a later chapter. Applied research is for real world problems, right? So think about it in, okay, a quick question, and you can unmute if you want this, and you'd have to type it in the chat box. But what year, or you can even give a gap, a range, was the idea of Bluetooth and Skype first introduced? You know, now you can FaceTime, you can Duo, you can do all of those things. But when did that come to fruition? When was that first introduced?
I'm gonna say, man, probably 05? Or is that
Okay.
not?
I want to go with 07.
You're gonna go with where?
08. 08.
08,
05.
okay.
Early 2000s.
06.
Okay.
So are we talking about like the concept, or when was it actually like used?
Yeah, the concept.
Oh, the concept. Well,
Yeah.
then I guess my answer's wrong because I know like
Well, if it's the concept, then go all the
far
way back
back,
to Star
yeah.
Trek.
Oh, I thought you meant like when it first like people started using it and all that. Like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was about to say the concepts have been, ever since like before the, was it the 20th century then?
Well, let's not go back that far.
I know, but there was like, what is it? There's like, there was what was it? It was a drawing of a concept of what would the year 2000 be like, and people were like, on rocket shoes and all that. So I was just wondering if that was the case.
1969.
oh, sure.
Yeah.
Now, and I know a lot of you guys are pretty young, but for those who follow Star Trek, in the late 60s and 70s, Star Trek, Lieutenant Uhura was the only person who could talk to Starfleet Command. And she was the only person that had a device in her ear that she could press and talk to them. And then Captain Kirk and those guys would, if they were talking to Klingons or somebody else, they would say, put them on screen. So all of that stuff, the concept of all of that stuff was as early as the 70s and late 60s. However, it never came to fruition because technology wouldn't support it until the middle 1990s. So Bluetooth didn't happen, and real cell phone technology, smartphones and all of that didn't happen till almost 20 or 30 years after the concept, right? But when cell phones came out, nobody knew anything about cell phone technology. So that would be applied research because it was something new, right? If you look at some of the things that are happening now with the technology, there is no background to support any information or research having been done on that. So applied research it takes a real-time position on something that's occurring and then trying to study it because it's being studied effectively for the first time. And that's the difference. Basic research advances existing information. Applied research looks for information and research on something that has not previously been studied. That's really the difference. And of course, as we look at that, excuse me, something as simple as this. Now, many of you, because of course, again, millennials, Generation X, if you can Google this, if you Google the steering wheel for a 1940s car, it will be almost as large as your monitor, your computer monitor. It was huge. But that also meant that it blocked all of the instruments that showed you gas, oil pressure, odometer, speedometer, all of those things, they were blocked. So to ergonomically change the way that people drive, they decreased the size of the steering wheel so that you also had access to all of these monitors. Something as simple as a range, an oven range, right? Because if I look at this first one, now I've got two of the instruments on top of each other. Does this instrument mean that it's for this one because it's closest to it? Or because it's on the top, does it mean that one? Now, it may not matter a lot to us, But if you have a child who doesn't understand the difference and then does something that causes harm, now you would take heed to it. Well, something as simple as just offsetting the instruments so that this one not only is at the top, but also to the right, more likely you're going to associate it with this range as opposed to this one. So this ergonomic stuff, applied research in psychology, you think of it, even some of the chairs that you currently sit in, the ergonomic chairs, right? Because of the need to increase health. And I don't know how many of you do it, and they haven't done this yet on a laptop, but most of you, and I'll try to position this so that you can see it. But as you're typing, notice your wrists tend to be straight naturally. But as you're typing, that means that your hands have to exercise your wrists to go across the keyboard. And so that increases the possibility of carpal tunnel. And so they've taken keyboards now that are skewed and sideways so that now your hands go over the keyboard, but your wrists stay natural. So something that simple is how they would use applied research to increase the possibility related to health, to longevity, to whatever else, right? So that's the idea. Now, no matter what research they do, all of it must follow the 6 steps of the scientific method. So let's talk about this a bit. Question and literature review. Now, those are contained within the same step, and here's why. The basic question is, if I do this, does it matter? Because if I do a study that has no value to anyone, then it's not a valid study, nor is it a significant study. So the first question is, do we need to evaluate this further, and does it matter? Well, it's always good to have a starting point, but if there's already literature and research that exists that can give you a different starting point, that's why the literature review. So the literature review allows you to go out and see what research already exists so that now you know what you're dealing with and what your starting point is. After you've defined the question and looked for existing literature, then you create a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is this. Let's see. A specific prediction about how one factor or variable is related to another. So simply in that statement, it says that you must have at least 2 variables. And it is always a statement of comparison. So something will increase related to something else, something will decrease related to something else, or something will stay the same. And because it's a question or a statement of belief, it doesn't mean that it's proven yet. It simply means that it's something that we want to prove given a particular perspective or position. So if I were to type, and I'll do that here, let's insert. So if I were to say that I believe, let's say, that women in a psychology class score higher on exams than men, right? Is that true? What did you say, Sydney?
I said probably.
And
debate
why
you
is it
on
true?
that.
I'm sorry, Stephen? Why is it true?
Debate
Why is
you
it
on that.
Okay, why?
I feel as if, based on my experience, women have more of they know what their goal is or what they have to do more. I feel like men get way more distracted easier. Like to the journey. Like we have an end goal, but we get way more distracted.
I agree with that.
Okay, all right. So, all right, men bashing. All right, but the question or the response is we don't know, right? Because Stephen, you're absolutely right. You feel that, but there's nothing to support that it's true, right? Because we haven't tested it yet. Same for Sydney. She could agree or disagree, but the point is, it's simply something that we have no data to support. Now, if you have data, that's one thing, but at this particular juncture, we don't. So it's simply a statement that I believe to be true, but in order for me to validate it, I have to create an experiment. So this hypothesis has the two variables, women and men, and then it has a state, meaning that I believe that women score higher than men. So now I have a reference. Well, I can make that statement, but until I prove it, I can't publish it. So that's why we create the hypothesis so we can see what it is we're trying to measure. And then third step is we create a design. How are we going to test it? So I've got 4 Psych 200 classes this semester. So I literally could segregate after every exam women's scores and men's scores. And then at the end of the semester, I could look at the average of all of those scores and say, you know what, based on my hypothesis, women do score higher on exams than men, or as a result of my experiment, you know, for what I see, they're very close. So I don't know that one does score higher than the other. Or I could look at the outcome and say, you know, the majority of this particular experiment, the men's averages are higher than women, so my hypothesis is wrong. So that's all it is. The research design is how do you plan to test your hypothesis? Once you design that, then the next step is to actually execute it. Now I would produce the exams, I would collect the scores, and then I would do an average of those to analyze the results. Once I get the results, then I can publish them saying that the hypothesis is true, false, or there is no conclusive evidence to say that one is better than the other. Once it's published, then I can say that based on that outcome, I either have a theory that says that this isn't true and here's why, or this is true and this is why, or it doesn't matter and it depends and here's why. But those 6 steps are always the steps that are in place in order to create an acceptable theory, a valid theory. Any questions on this? Either of those steps?
No.
Okay. All right. So there again is the definition hypothesis. So it doesn't change really. The wording still supports exactly what we said before. It's a tentative and testable explanation about the relationship between 2 or more variables. But because it's a relationship, it is either going to be equal to, greater than, or less than. Right? So I have to have at least 2 variables that I want to check the relationship between. And I make a prediction on what that comparison is going to be. And then I simply determine whether or not it's true or not. The operational definition is not unlike I said, when we take the exam, we're going to administer the exams, collect the information. But the operational definition simply is that how do I plan to operationalize this experiment so that I'm either going to do it through questionnaires, surveys, observation, interviews, it doesn't matter. But you identify what it is and how you're going to do it so that if someone else tries to duplicate your experiment, they're using the exact same conditions. And then, as I said before, statistical significance is simply, it starts at 90%. The ideal is either 95%, 99%, 97%, or 99%. And the idea is that if 90 or 900 out of 1,000 times, that if I put these conditions in place, I will get the same result. Of course, if I get 950 out of 1,000, then I'm more certain that the conditions work. And if I get 990 out of 1,000, so it's either 90%, 95%, 97%, or 99%. Very seldom do we 100% because there is a level of subjectivity. But something is statistically significant if I trust that it's as a result of the conditions and not by chance or luck. Okay. All right. So I don't see anything in the chat room, so I'll assume that we are still okay. And so I will continue. Well, let me check the chat room because maybe I missed something. Nope. Okay. All right. So let's look. Meta-analysis is simply this. So let's say that you want to research shoes. So you look at different kinds of shoes, leather shoes, cloth shoes, flip-flops, running shoes, sporting shoes, whatever they are. And you look at shoes. What's something else that may impact my research on shoes?
Probably the style of the shoe.
The size of the shoe.
What was that, Alex?
The size of the shoe.
Okay, shoe sizes.
How
Right.
comfortable it is. Color.
Yeah, and when you talk about comfortability, it could be the shoe, but what else could cause discomfort?
The design.
Small.
Too
small.
Design.
Your feet. Right? So a meta-analysis simply says, let's take multiple views and collect as much associative data as we can. So even though we may have been looking at shoes, there are other things that can impact the comfortability, size, all of those things of shoes and whether or not they are the best or not the best, whatever they are. So it just takes multiple studies and combines those related studies to come up with an outcome that is greater than doing an independent study or an individual study. That's all that means. And then, as I said about a theory, it's an explanation for the phenomenon, and it doesn't have to support it. It doesn't have to say that it's true. It can be an explanation for the phenomenon that refutes the hypothesis. But it's as a result of experimentation and research to determine that outcome. So there are a couple of things, of course, as with anything, the reason for doing all of this research stuff, one is, again, to answer the question, what is it that needs to be studied? And once we have an idea of what it is we're trying to study, what the variables are, does it matter? If it doesn't matter, or if there's no relevant reason for doing the research, then we probably won't do the experiment. But if there is a reason for doing it, then now we can change the conditions or even change what causes that outcome. There is a, and I won't go much into it, but on Hulu, I just watched a video last night, and it was a guy who was responsible for doing sound evaluation. And he came to this conclusion that every part of New York has a different sound frequency using the regular music scale. So in some areas it was an A minor, in others it was a D major, and some G minor, but he actually looked at the effect of the sounds within the buildings and from the street, and he could go in and change the nature of someone's home so that it diminished the sounds that cause certain behaviors, right? So now a lot of people look at that and say, well, who cares, man? I'm living in the house, you know, I got my chicken, right? But other people would say, you know, I'm depressed a lot. These particular things, I'm anxious, I'm stressed out. And he was able to discern that certain frequencies in homes by certain appliances cause states of depression and stress, right? So again, some things we don't see openly, but someone may have an idea of how it can apply to any condition. And then our prediction is simply that we believe this is going to happen. It doesn't have to be true. We're simply creating a condition so we know what we're measuring for. And then ideally, so that if we look at outcomes that can be changed, we can promote a change in that environment or even people's lives to help them change ideally for the better. So some of the things that we will use to do that is not only those 6 steps, but how we go about conducting the experiment. So there are multiple ways of doing descriptive research, and it's that simple. We're simply trying to watch something, and based on what we see, create a description of not only what happened, but as much as we can, why it happened. The research that systematically observes and records behavior and mental processes without manipulating the variables. So again, if I go in and manipulate the variables, then I'm causing the outcome that I want. What we want to do is look at a natural state so that we can determine what the real conditions are that cause this particular outcome so that we can deal with it. Well, one way of doing descriptive research is naturalistic observation. For those who either are or are not familiar with Jane Goodall is considered the premier research scientist on apes and gorillas. Well, she didn't go into a zoo. What she did was she went into the jungle and lived for 2 years in the jungle among apes and gorillas because she wanted to see them in their natural habitat so that the record of the things that were happening, the behaviors and mental processes that were happening were as a result of natural conditions. You can also do surveys. So of course, that's not unlike in the political climate that we're currently in. A lot of surveys are being done. How do you feel about Democrats? How do you feel about Republicans? How do you feel about independents? How do you feel about anything? And so simply there, we're trying to take a large enough sample that it becomes representative of the larger population. Because very seldom are you going to get 100% of the population. And then a case study is generally used when there is a single condition that is either being experienced by one person or the same condition is being experienced by a group of people. So that you do a case study to discern specifically what's causing that behavior in that person or in that group who have a like disorder or a like issue. For instance, if someone had, I don't know, an aversion to cigarettes, and rather than it just causing lung cancer, maybe they had another outbreak of something that wasn't understood. Well, if they are a singular person with that condition, the case study would be to look at that single research person and then discern what is causing their particular condition. If I've got a group of people who are experiencing the same kind of outbreak, then I can look at them simultaneously, see if I can isolate what's singularly common among the group. So that's really the difference between naturalistic observation, survey, and case studies. Then there's also archival research, approach that studies existing data to find answers to research questions. Now, there was an experiment. Is anyone familiar with the Tuskegee experiment?
Is that the experiment where they had a group of black men and some of them had syphilis and then some of them didn't, and they just watched them over the span of 40 years without actually treating like half of them?
Oh, that's actually very close. So that's very good. In fact, it was about 20 to 30 men, and none of them had syphilis. They actually injected them all with syphilis. So they brought them into, and this was performed by the CDC, no less, but they brought 20 to 30 African-American men in Tuskegee, Alabama, brought them into an environment and injected them without their knowledge, injected every one of them with syphilis. And then they studied them over the years to see what the conditions would create as a result of this injected disease. Now, the reason that applies here to archival research, because none of the participants are still alive, none of the clinicians, the doctors, nurses, or anyone else who were part of the study are alive. So you can't go and ask people questions. So now, in order to get that research and understand what happened with it, we have to go to the archives. We have to go to the pre-existing data and look at the studies to see what the information was. And that's archival research. Okay? All right. So now let's get into some good stuff. Let's see, where are we at? We start, what time do we start? 12:45? 45,
Sounds about right.
Yeah,
Oh, we're-
12:45.
Yeah, we're pretty close to the end, huh?
It ends at 2:05.
Man, and I was having fun. Okay. All right. You guys got me. Okay. So let's do this because correlations can be, it's not complex, but it's worth spending a little more time than 5 minutes. So what we will do is end here and we will start with correlations on Monday. Okay. So before we close out, any questions on anything we've talked about? Any clarification needed? Okay, then your last assignment is simply to type into the chat room, goodbye.
Thank
Have a
you.
great weekend, and I will see you guys on Monday.
Thank you very much.
Have a good weekend, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Humphrey. Thank you so
Have a
much.
good one.
Thank
You're
you.
more than
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye. I'll put the recording out later.